Okay. So this is a speech by Henry Cabot Lodge in the United States Senate, read August 12th, 1919. I think this has been cut in a few places, so it's not the entire speech, it's just the relevant parts that this book has chosen. And this speech, read on August 12, 1919, to the U.S. Senate during the Great Debate on Post-War Foreign Policy, so after World War I, made the case against Woodrow Wilson's campaign for the United States to join the League of Nations. So after World War I, Woodrow Wilson, the President of the United States, had this idea for a League of Nations with his 14 points, a gathering of all the nations of the earth where we could have a forum which was able to act as a medium for us to talk together, to come to an agreement about international rules and laws, to resist aggression from other states, right? Attack one of us, attack all of us, therefore we can all uphold our own borders. We're all a member of this League of Nations, dozens, hundreds of states are part of this member of League of Nations, and we all guarantee our borders so we can all grow together as it is. And famously, the United States Senate refused to sign on to the League of Nations, which obviously weakened it tremendously. The League of Nations eventually failed and died out. Then after World War II, the idea was revisited, turned into the UN, which has had great successes and some failures. Okay. So Lodge's view, not Wilson's, prevailed. That's what's going on here. And so Lodge is in the U.S. Senate, and he is giving a speech against the U.S. joining the League of Nations. I object in the strongest possible way to having the United States agree, directly or indirectly, to be controlled by a league which may at any time, and perfectly lawfully and in accordance with the terms of the covenant, be drawn in to deal with internal conflicts in other countries, no matter what those conflicts may be. We should never permit the United States to be involved in any internal conflict in another country, except by the will of her people expressed through the Congress which represents them. Those of us, Mr. President, who are either wholly opposed to the League or who are trying to preserve the independence and the safety of the United States by changing the terms of the League, and who are endeavoring to make of the League, if we are to be a member of it, less certain to promote war instead of peace, have been reproached with selfishness in our outlook and with a desire to keep our country in a state of isolation. So far as the question of isolation goes, it is impossible to isolate the United States. I well remember the time 20 years ago when eminent senators and other distinguished gentlemen, who were opposing the Philippines and shrieking about imperialism, sneered at the statement made by some of us that the United States had become a world power. I think no one now would question that the Spanish War marked the entrance of the United States into world affairs to a degree which had never obtained before. It was both an inevitable and an irrevocable step, and our entrance into the war with Germany certainly showed once and for all that the United States was not unmindful of its world responsibilities. We may set aside all this empty talk about isolation. Nobody expects to isolate the United States or to make it a hermit nation, which is a sheer absurdity. But there is a wide difference between taking a suitable part and bearing a due responsibility in world affairs and plunging the United States into every controversy and conflict on the face of the globe. By meddling in all the differences which may arise among any portion or fragment of humankind, we simply fritter away our influence and injure ourselves to no good purpose. We shall be of far more value to the world and its peace by occupying, so far as possible, the situation which we have occupied for the last 20 years, and by adhering to the policy of Washington and Hamilton, of Jefferson and Monroe, under which we have risen to our present greatness and prosperity. It has been reiterated here on this floor, and reiterated to the point of weariness, that in every treaty there is some sacrifice of sovereignty. That is not a universal truth by any means, but it is true of some treaties, and it is a platitude which does not require reiteration. The question, and the only question before us, is how much of our sovereignty we are justified in sacrificing. In what I have already said about other nations putting us into the war, I have covered one point of sovereignty which ought never to be yielded: the power to send American soldiers and sailors everywhere, which ought never to be taken from the American people or impaired in the slightest degree. Let us beware how we palter with our independence. Contrast the United States with any country on the face of the earth today, and ask yourself whether the situation of the United States is not the best to be found. I will go as far as anyone in world service, but the first step to world service is the maintenance of the United States. You may call me selfish if you will, conservative or reactionary, or use any other harsh adjective you see fit to apply. But an American I was born, an American I have remained all my life. I can never be anything else but an American, and I must think of the United States first. And when I think of the United States first in an arrangement like this, I am thinking of what is best for the world. For if the United States fails, the best hopes of mankind fail with it. I have never had but one allegiance. I cannot divide it now. I have loved but one flag, and I cannot share that devotion and give affection to the mongrel banner invented for a league, internationalism, illustrated by the Bolshevik and by the men to whom all countries are alike, provided they can make money out of them, is to me repulsive. National I must remain, and in that way I, like all other Americans, can render the amplest service to the world. The United States is the world's best hope, but if you fetter her in the interests and quarrels of other nations, if you tangle her in the intrigues of Europe, you will destroy her power for good and endanger her very existence. Leave her to march freely through the centuries to come as in the years that have gone. Strong, generous, and confident, she has nobly served mankind. Beware how you trifle with your marvelous inheritance, this great land of ordered liberty, for if we stumble and fall, freedom and civilization everywhere will go down in ruin. We are told that we shall break the heart of the world if we do not take this league just as it stands. I fear that the hearts of the vast majority of mankind would beat on strongly and steadily and without any quickening if the league were to perish altogether. If it should be efficiently and beneficently changed, the people who would lie awake in sorrow for a single night could be easily gathered in one not very large room. But those who would draw a long breath of relief would reach to millions. We hear much of visions, and I trust we shall continue to have visions and dream dreams of a fairer future for the race. But visions are one thing, and visionaries are another, and the mechanical appliances of the rhetorician, designed to give a picture of a present which does not exist, and of a future which no man can predict, are as unreal and short-lived as the steam or canvas clouds, the angels suspended on wires, and the artificial lights of the stage. They pass with a moment of effect and are shabby and tawdry in the daylight. Let us at least be real. Washington's entire honesty of mind and his fearless look into the face of all facts are qualities which can never go out of fashion and which we should all do well to imitate. No doubt, many excellent and patriotic people see a coming fulfillment of noble ideals in the words League for Peace. We all respect and share these aspirations and desires, but some of us see no hope, but rather defeat for them in this murky covenant. For we, too, have our ideals, even if we differ from those who have tried to establish a monopoly of idealism. Our first ideal is our country, and we see her in the future, as in the past, giving service to all her people and to the world. Our ideal of the future is that she should continue to render that service of her own free will. She has great problems of her own to solve, very grim and perilous problems and a right solution. If we can attain to it, which would largely benefit mankind, we would have our country strong to resist a peril from the west, as she has flung back the German menace from the east. We would not have our politics distracted and embittered by the dissensions of other lands. We would not have our country's vigor exhausted, or her moral force abated, by everlasting meddling and muddling in every quarrel, great and small, which afflicts the world. Our ideal is to make her ever stronger and better and finer, because in that way alone, as we believe, can she be of the greatest service to the world's peace and to the welfare of mankind. Okay. So, obviously, this did not work out. The U.S. decided not to enter the League of Nations, isolated itself more or less, militarily at least, for a while. But then we ended up having the Great Depression, and it turns out that America was linked economically with the rest of the world. That Great Depression was part of a larger effort, a larger problem. We had the Depression in Germany and the Weimar Republic around the same time, and so on. The world suffered shocks. The U.S. suffered shocks and terrible events, and we had the Dust Bowl, and so on and so on and so on. Then the history rolled on, and eventually Germany rose up again as the Nazis and started threatening Europe. They marched across Europe, overthrew, Poland, Belgium, France, and were on the shores staring across the Channel in England, allying themselves with Italy, and then the United States sort of set back, ended up sending arms and money to England, and then the Germans allied with the Japanese. The Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor because they wanted to expand into the Pacific, and they thought the United States was standing in their way. The United States also decided to stop selling them oil, which Japanese understood to be the United States marking them out as an enemy and preparing to attack them, and so on and so on. Then we had World War II, and then we formed the UN, with probably one of the great mistakes of the UN as a body is arguably the Security Council. The UN as a place of discussion, the UN as a forum for national efforts to combat illnesses, as a place where we can create things like the IMF to stabilize the world economy. That generally works. The UN as a interventionist military force, not so much. There have been some successes in parts of Africa and then in the Balkans, as far as I know, and possibly in a few other places, but it turned into the Americans versus the Soviets. Then there was all the hubbub around China and Taiwan and which one takes the seat, and all sorts of little great complications working into it. And we end up in the modern day where the U.S. has arguably, rejected this speech, Henry Cabot Lodge's speech, almost entirely. We are engaged in every part of the world. We do act unilaterally in many, many ways, in many, many cases. We act unilaterally as far as regards our sanctions, as far as regards, the invasion of Iraq, as far as regards our actions towards Israel, as far as regards, right now we're having a tiff with, what is it? I want to say Venezuela. And then if we're sending people to San Salvador, and we're arguing over the history of places like Greenland, pretending we can do things and so on. The United States is trying, at least, to shift its weight around in a loud and burlish way these days. Often making mistakes, I would argue. Unforced mistakes is sort of our forte. Vietnam is another example of the U.S. acting unilaterally, even within the structure of the UN, right? Even as the UN existed, the U.S. is still able to act unilaterally by itself as it wishes in many ways. It's entirely, they're very different. It is very different to defy the UN as in go against the wishes of the UN, as opposed to just act without the blessing of the UN. And we can act without the blessing of the UN. We've done that very often. As for acting against the UN, Israel is one of the big examples right now. There are complaints that the UN has overstepped certain boundaries, right? This is what Cabot Lodge is arguing against sovereignty. You have things like the International Criminal Court, which I believe the U.S. doesn't recognize. It won't extradite people necessarily to the International Criminal Court. It won't allow the criminal court to judge American soldiers or citizens, as far as I know. And the U.S., pushes the UN to do things, and it doesn't. We, as the U.S., place sanctions on people, and so on. But what can also happen in the UN, as it is a group of people, is that powerful nations, like those in the Security Council, right, like Russia, China, or France sometimes, England, the USA, can ignore the UN almost entirely, using it only when it benefits them, and then ignoring it or defying it or gumming up its works when that benefits them. Smaller countries can use the UN as a sort of forum for complaints, of course, and also a forum for criticism. But then you look at the size of the economy, the size of the military, and the U.S. is saying, why do we have to listen to all these little tin pot countries when they don't have any power? It just happens to be 100 of them that don't like what the U.S. is doing at this particular time. But again, the U.S. has ignored that, and these countries would not like what the U.S. is doing anyway. And you always have the issue that what the U.S. thinks is a tin pot country now may not be a tin pot country 10 years from now. Oil is found, or they become a democracy, or they turn into China and become an economic powerhouse without democracy, and all of a sudden the U.S. is nice and friendly, and you matter now, right? So the question arises: what does the UN do that is mentioned in this piece, which is negative, right? So the question I suppose I want to ask is he right? And he does have, the speech here does have a few points which make sense. The problem, I think, is that the world has changed. In Washington's day, there was this idea that the U.S. could stay isolationist. The U.S. didn't have to entangle itself with other countries and could just grow as it does. And this, of course, ignores the fact that the only reason the U.S. achieved independence at all from Britain is because France was fighting Britain at the same time. France was giving us arms. France was helping us. The reason that one of the reasons the Revolutionary War started is because of the French and Indian War, which was between Britain and France and the French allies up and down the Mississippi, in which Britain won and then theoretically opened up land to the west of the Appalachians for settlement, but Britain made agreements with the Indian tribes living in the area not to do that, and there was this constant pressure from the American settlers to, ride over the mountains, kill a bunch of people, take their land. From its very beginning, the United States has been a country that interacts with other countries around it. That is because we live in an economy that is, I would say, mixed, right? It doesn't take 2.5 weeks to get to Britain anymore. It takes less than a day. When we build something, when we build a chair, even, in the United States, that metal is mined somewhere in Australia, taken, as ore, taken to India, India, let's say, to be smelted into metal, then shipped over to China, where it's formed and cast and cut into bolts and legs, and then there's wood that is cut in Canada, and that's all shipped to the United States, then put together, then turned into a chair. This is one possible example of how an item might be created, and that's talking about a chair of metal and wood, two things. And hypothetically, you involve 5 countries in that. And when we talk about a computer or a book even, when we talk about the clothing I'm wearing, then all of a sudden the United States is interacting with other countries. And the U.S. doesn't have to do this. The U.S. is large and strong enough that it is self-sufficient for most items. We could be entirely isolationist, lock ourselves away from the world. We could have no truck whatsoever with the UN. And we would, in many ways, be exactly where we are at today, except, I would say, poorer and more vulnerable. We entered World War II because it turned out that Japan was expanding and running into our territory. Germany was expanding and planning to attack the United States after taking over Europe. There was a telegram sent to Mexico from Germany, where Germany was asking Mexico to rise up and attack the United States to take back the land they had lost in the Mexican-American War. And that was another thing that pushed the United States into World War II, because aggressive countries don't stop. They keep expanding until something stops them, until something halts them, until they run into a wall or a ditch or a giant army that says, "Thou shall not pass. This point and no further." And in the far past, you had countries that ran into logistical problems, right? If you are in the 1100s and you want to conquer a country on the other side of the planet, it's very difficult to do, to get people over there, to keep them going. But nowadays, what was the conquistadors that invaded the Aztecs, 300 of them, with gunpowder and metal, taking advantage of the diseases they brought with them and the internal conflicts already existent in the political status of the area they were taking over. Right? I'm getting off track here, but what I mean to say is the world has gotten smaller and more interconnected. And the fact is that if other parts of the world are organizing and talking and getting together and acting with each other in some way, learning to trust each other, creating economic systems that work well together, and the United States stands outside of that, then the question really becomes, is the United States by itself, isolated from the rest of the world, unengaging with the rest of the world, actually greater than the rest of the world combined? And I don't think that's likely. Okay, so he says this here: contrast the United States with any country on the face of the earth today and ask yourself whether the situation of the United States is not the best to be found. Keep in mind, this is 1919. We're about to enter the roaring 20s. There is massive racial discrimination across the entire nation. There are people working in factories. There are children losing thumbs. I think we've just begun to create an income tax, I think, in 1913 or so. There are many things the government just does not do, which we take for granted. Granted today. Health service, national food handouts, the electrification of the nation, that sort of thing, which are only possible because of items that we receive from the rest of the world. The United States economy grows primarily because we are selling things to the rest of the world. We aren't pushing our economy solely by our own consumption. It just so happens that large areas of the world are undergoing population increases, or have been destroyed, or are industrializing, and the United States is mostly untouched because of that, which happens again in World War II. And one thing that the United States has always had this viewpoint, right, that it's the best in the world. Well, what makes the United States the best in the world? It's the idea, it's the ideal, it's the shining city on a hill that it represents and still does represent to many people. It's the story America tells about itself. And there is an obvious problem in the story that Henry Cabot Lodge is telling here. Okay. Okay. He is basically saying that the United States is better equipped to help the world by not becoming part of the League of Nations. That is, the United States can help the world by refusing to become part of the world, right? By refusing to engage, by refusing to try to lead this League of Nations to a better world, by refusing to help it, by standing outside and saying that is doomed to fail from the start. There's no possible way it will stand up. It's stupid and dumb and obviously illogical. It is immoral, right? That's what Henry Cabot Lodge is saying here, that the United States needs to save its effort for something else, whatever that is. The United States needs to act by itself, ignoring what others do, ignoring the output of others' ideas. The United States needs not to become entangled in political or military adventures outside of its borders. Well, that's fine, but then what that also means is you don't become entangled in economic ventures outside your borders. If you sit there and refuse to have any hand in the tiller, refuse to have a voice in the evolution of the nations outside your borders, and those nations are going to move in ways which you will have less of an effect on than if you had joined the League of Nations, right? So one thing to always remember is just because you join the League of Nations, as we see today, just because you join the UN, does not mean you are forced to do anything. International law does not exist. There is no enforcement mechanism that stands outside of the countries themselves. The countries have to agree to a... what's the word? Agree to a treaty, and then they have to follow that treaty afterwards. Of course, if you betray the treaty, then other people and other countries in the future won't sign treaties with you because you're obviously going to lie about that. That threat, I think, is overblown. I mean, look at Russia and Russia and North Korea. I mean, you can sign agreements with them, but what makes you think they're going to hold to those agreements, right? The fact that they'll hold to them just long enough to deny they're breaking them, or where it benefits them in some way, in which case you didn't need a treaty in the first place because they're acting as benefits them. And right, so either you need entanglements or you don't. Either you talk or you don't. Either you are willing to fight or you don't. You know, the United States was... okay, so the origin of the United States Navy, of course, is against Britain, but as a special power, was put together in order to protect U.S. shipping interests in Europe. Specifically, it was the Barbary pirates in North Africa, who had been essentially bandits preying on the sea trade of Europe for 100 years, and Europe just paid them off. The European powers with money would pay them off to not rob their ships. They'd still rob a ship once in a while, just to let England and France and Italy know that they were there. But for the most part, they just subsided on the tribute paid by the greater nations. The United States was entering into its economic power, essentially, and started shipping things around in the Mediterranean where all this was going on. The Barbary pirates would attack U.S. ships and ask for the U.S. to pay their ransom, the U.S. to pay them off, the U.S. indemnity, and so on. The U.S. declined to do so, and when the U.S. asked Europe to help them fight these Barbary pirates, Europe declined to do so. So the United States made its own navy, and then sent them to attack the Barbary pirates. From the shores of Tripoli, I believe, is in the Marine Hymn, and it references this situation, where the United States first finds itself in an economic issue, and then seeks to work with other countries who decline to work with it, so the United States acts in a military way to protect its own economic interests. So this is arguably what happens quite often. When the U.S. intervenes in, let's say, South America because of sugar plantations, or when the U.S. intervenes in Cuba and Florida, when the U.S. intervenes in Texas, when the U.S. intervenes in the Middle East, especially today, when the U.S. intervenes in Europe, it is to protect economic interests. So even today, the UN acts in such a way, and the U.S. essentially ignores it a lot of the time. So the U.S. is going to be entangled anyway. And now you have an organization out there, the League of Nations or the UN, and if the U.S. declines to take part in that, You don't have to follow the rules as it is. You don't have to be subservient to them, because if you are a great and powerful nation, if you are China or Russia, then you theoretically have enough power that the nations of the world are going to listen to you anyway, whether or not you are part of the UN. But if they are in the UN or the League of Nations and you aren't in it, then they're talking without you. And that means they're going to be coming to agreements without you. And that means that you are going to suffer in the long run, right? So what I mean to say is, like, this idea that Henry Cabot Lodge it has, where the United States should be isolationist and the United States should act for itself, pursue its own interests in all ways. The United States is a great help for the world if it acts without entanglement with the world, is a paradox. Inactivity. You cannot both be great and small, if that makes sense. So the problem starts to arise eventually. What happens when you get where we are today? That's what the United States has essentially done what I've mentioned. They have taken the paradox that Lodge talks about here and broken it by saying that we are becoming part of the international order, but we also act alone by ourselves. And we act with allies in certain ways. We act with NATO. We might act with a particular country, like, I don't know, say Israel or or Saudi Arabia or San Salvador or Japan and South Korea, or the Philippines or Guam as that's not entirely exactly a country, but the idea is there, or England or China, one by one, outside of the structures of the UN, but using the UN as a sort of forum. It's not the be-all, end-all. It's not the proof of things, but it's a start. It's some place to work with. And the major issue, of course, that Henry Cabot Lodge raises here is that theoretically, if the League of Nations protects the borders of those nations which are a part of it from the other nations, then the U.S. would send troops overseas in order to protect those borders. That is, the U.S. would die. That is, the U.S. would subsidize the defense of these other countries. So for these other countries, that's a great idea. Right? If you are some landlocked country somewhere in Eurasia and you have 7 borders with 7 different countries, one of which is expansionist, another of which is having political problems, a third of which is filled with your ancestral enemies or something, then you would like some help defending those borders, because you don't know what's going to happen. And if people start ganging up on you, you're in big trouble, a la Poland. Right? Whereas if you're the U.S., in theory, you're looking at this and saying, hey, Canada's not invading me in the next 50 years. Mexico isn't invading me in the next 50 years. There's really no country on Earth which is invading me in the next 50 years successfully. They'd have to build up a giant navy. I mean, even if we fought China's not invading the continental United States. China's stopping at Hawaii or something. So what's in it for the U.S.? What is in it? What benefit does the U.S. have to subsidize the defense of other countries? Well, there's 2 ideas in there that I'd like to look at. The first is that we have to send American troops over to die. And as we know from Ukraine, that is not the case. We can send American equipment over. We can send American money over. This happened in World War II with the Lend-Lease Act, before we entered the war, we sent supplies over to England, right? That is, to leap straight from the United States must defend the borders of another country. Therefore, the United States must send troops to die in the defense of that other country for no benefit to itself, is a gigantic jump, which is not followed by the facts. There are middle steps to take. There are, economic sanctions. They're sending money. There is, I think, also the idea that a country ought to be able to defend itself, and if we defend that, there's a difference between helping a country defend itself and defending a country by itself or by ourselves, right? As well, you have the idea that acting in concert with other countries, leads us to have allies. That was one of the great ideas of something like a League of Nations is, hey, if we all agree to gang up on anyone who attacks someone else, then no one will attack someone else, at least not directly. And for the most part, that has held up. This is something that is hard to explain without an overview of history, but the world since World War II has been historically in a very peaceful state. There have been wars, there have been battles, there have been massacres. Even the U.S. is involved in the Vietnamese War, the Korean War, the Desert Storm during this time period. And yet, if we look at any other period on the history of the world, we find that it's been relatively peaceful. The great countries haven't gone nuclear on each other. You don't have as much of an issue where Europe is fighting constantly. Every 3 years there's another battle over some hill or river somewhere. You don't have rebellions rising up in China, like the Boxer Rebellion, every 50 years trying to overthrow the government. You don't have tribal battles in Africa nearly as much. You have troubles in South America and Central America, but these are mostly smaller rebel groups. These are overthrows of the country by its own military sort of thing. These are not battles to the death between, Brazil and Chile over a mountaintop in the middle of nowhere. So the idea of the UN, the League of Nations, once put into effect and helped along with, greater military powers and greater economic powers, who were somewhat willing to act, did have the desired effect of a slightly safer world for the majority of people. I didn't say safe world, just slightly safer than it would have been otherwise. Just something simple like vaccination efforts. Something as immediate as technology transfers, creating genetically modified seeds, creating anti-pesticides, fixing famines by shipping food or grain from halfway around the planet. These are things which are very new in the history of human civilization, and mostly achieved because of something like the UN, because of agreements between sovereign nations who, not by giving up their sovereignty, but by choosing to act in concert, have increased their safety, have increased their ability to act in such a way that, England, who once ruled an empire upon which the sun never set, could not have dreamed of what England could do today. the number of people that the island can feed, the speed at which it can dispatch forces across the world, the ease at which you can communicate with someone in Japan, the fact of television, the level of, what do you call it, the quality of the level that the quality of life has arisen to in England, puts the greatest efforts of the world empire to shame. The fact is that the world is, for the average person, is better today than it has been for the majority of human existence, and this is due quite possibly to the U.S. becoming part of the UN. To the U.S. leaving its isolationism behind and entering into the world stage, willing to act. And this has benefited the United States, of course. What would have happened if the United States was not involved in the world, right? If the United States, after World War II, had retreated again, what would have happened? You would have had, the Soviet Union would have expanded. For example, I've read books which suggest that Africa would have devolved into these massive wars between artificial nations. The middle, who knows what would have gone on in the Middle East? Would China have arisen as a nation of her, to the level she has of power she has today, or would she have been attacked by a resurgent Japanese empire? There are lots of unknowns, and none of them look particularly good, is what I would argue. And I'm mentioning this because the talk seems to be happening again today in two separate ways. One is that there is this call for the U.S. to be more isolationist, right? For Europe should defend itself. That the U.S. shouldn't interfere in other countries as much. What the U.S. is always calling on other countries for human rights abuses, but then look at what the U.S. is doing to its own immigrants right now. And issues like that, there's always been this sense of hypocrisy in certain actions the U.S. has taken. And one of the responses has historically been to say, well, the U.S. should involve itself with other countries. The U.S. should be isolationist. The U.S. should stop doing, whatever it's doing at the time. Because the U.S. could be feeding starving children, and there's some person outside the U.S. and some person inside the U.S. that both think that's a bad idea for some reason. Why are we sending men to the moon? We could spend that money on the continental United States, improving our lives or making some industrialist richer or something like that. And I would argue that history has shown that doesn't work. That isolating yourself just makes the world more dangerous, it paints a target on your back because you don't have any friends. And, if the U.S. was 5 or 6 times the size it is today, maybe you would have a point, but I think it incredibly unlikely. The United States just isn't as strong as it thinks it is by itself. Not when we look at the time period of decades and centuries. Not when we look past the issues of the moment to the issues of generations. The United States still needs the rest of the world, and then the rest of the world, if the United States is to do good, needs to have the United States engaging with it, taking in the good ideas, and improving ourselves. We aren't the ultimate geniuses of the planet. Why is the U.S. historically been a place where the sciences are studied very highly. Well, we weren't. The only reason the US is ahead in the sciences is because of Germany gave state support to its sciences for a long time and then kicked out all the Jewish scientists who came to the United States. This is why we have the nuclear bomb, for example. A bunch of German scientists came over. This is, the US before World War II was not thought of as a place where one came for intellectual enterprises, right? You weren't, Harvard and Yale were nice, yes, but you wanted to go to Paris, you wanted to go to Berlin, you wanted to go to England for the best education in the world. And after World War II, you wanted to go to the US. And that is because of, the changing circumstances of the planet also, but also because the US opened itself up to outside influences and learned from them. The strength of the United States has never been in her people, but in her openness to the world, is what I would argue. And a second bit is that it is often argued today, especially by, I would say, the administration we have at the moment, that the United States should act more unilaterally. The United States should act in a more belligerent manner, ignoring the wishes and the will of other countries and trying to run roughshod over them because the United States is the greatest country and the most powerful country in the world. And yeah, that works for a while. But then again, if you look at decades and centuries, it doesn't. It fails, is what I would argue. It is doomed to make enemies. It is doomed to cause problems. It sends us back to an older way of thinking, which Hodge here stands for, where it's nation against nation, a war to the knife, a zero-sum game. We don't work together. We need to work apart. And that's how we become great, by the United States being better than other countries in every way, instead of the United States bettering itself with other countries, bettering the world. It's oxymoronic that Lodge here and the political establishment of the world today is like, America should be great and wonderful and powerful and it does good for the world, but we're going to ignore the wishes and will of the world. The idea that Lodge is talking here is that the United States is smarter, better than the rest of the planet, and why are we pretending that we are not? Well, why is the United States in such a state that it can even begin to think of that? If you are, I don't know, let's say, what country can we pick on? If you were Mongolia, you were not sitting in Mongolia and the Mongolian parliament and saying, we are the greatest, best, smartest, richest, most powerful, most righteous nation on the planet. You're going to have a more balanced view of your existence. If you are France, then you're going to look at them and you say, hey, maybe we are the font of European civilization. Maybe we are a nuclear power. Maybe we are a world colonizer. Maybe we have wonderful education, wonderful art. But you're also remembering, hey, we got our butts kicked by Germany in 2 wars. We had the 100-Year War with England, and, we won that, but it was long. It was long fought. It was hard. It was difficult. You're going, well, we had the French Revolution, and, lots of people died. That wasn't great. And then we immediately went to Napoleon after that, and that wasn't really great. And yeah, sure, France is powerful, but it's a complicated situation, right? There's a long history. It goes back to the Franks and the Gauls and the Romans and so on, where you can study this and think on it and reflect. England is the same thing. We had an empire that covered the planet, and now we control the island of the sun and the moon and, half of the British Isles. I mean, Russia's looking at this and saying we used to be the Soviet Union and now we aren't. And then, well, once we were the Duchy of Moscow, and we were controlled by the Mongols. Before that, we were controlled by Novgorod, or the Ukrainians, or then the Vikings, and then it goes back to the Scythians, and so on and so on. If you're China, you're remembering the century of humiliation, and you're like, well, yeah, China's great and wonderful, but we're not always perfect. So why does the U.S. tend to stand out like this? Why is there this view in the U.S. that it's always been the greatest, the most wonderful, the most open, when, any school child learns in school that, okay, the U.S. wasn't great, the Pilgrims needed the help of the Indians to even survive here. The Spanish-American War was started because of sensationalism in the news. We kind of the birth of Texas isn't really that noble, considering they were all invited in by Mexico and then basically rebelled against it. We've seen the pictures of the civil rights movement. We've seen the pictures of, masses of buffalo killed in the Central Plains for no other reason than to starve the Indians out, and so on. There are terrible things the United States has done, but there's also always been this thread running through it which ignores all of that and pretends the United States is great without understanding why it is so. Like, how is it the United States has achieved the place in the world that it has today? How is it the United States has expanded? And I would say that it's because the United States is an idea more than a people. That life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that idea of having democracy, that idea of rights. The United States could disappear tomorrow, but those ideas will still exist and lead to something that looks very much like the United States arising in its place, is, one day at least, is what I would imagine happening. And isolating ourselves or acting as a bully all the time is injuring us in the future, because it injures our ideas and ideals. Lodge here is trying to defend the United States, but is not willing to put in the work to fix or improve it. It's a very static worldview. It's a very zero-sum game worldview, and I find that somewhat depressing that we're still going on about it. And we just, we've never learned, really. There's always been an undercurrent. There's always been an anti-intellectual undercurrent. There's always been a us against them view. There's always been a internal schism, I would say, in the United States, that we haven't figured out which way we really want to go as a nation. We haven't figured out really what we want to do or who we want to be as a nation, because we aren't a people that is here naturally, as it were, right? We didn't all grow up for the last 300 generations all looking the same and speaking the same language. We are a mixture of various parts of the entire planet. And we've become a great nation in the sense that Roosevelt spoke of, a great nation, because of our complexity, not our simplicity. And, looking at the world through a very basic viewpoint, even though it feels good and seems good and is an exercise of power. It is not an exercise of responsibility or prudence, is what I would argue. Is why I would have voted against Lodge in this case. Yep. Thank you.